Hi, I'm Diana Nichols. I lost my father when I was 16. When my husband was 57, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And when I was 61, I became a widow.
Hi, my name is Dave Nichols. I was a missionary, and I went through divorce at about age 34. Remarried a few years later, and approximately 25 years later, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer and passed away at about age, her age was about 55.
When my dad died, I felt like my world was just turned upside down.
When my wife left me, I felt confused. I was expecting God to honor my service to Him and not allow those kinds of things to happen.
When my husband got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I was afraid. I was fearful.
When Patty died of cancer, I felt very lonely. And I think again confused.
When Keith died of Alzheimer's, I felt relief. I felt that he was in his father's house and he had a room.
When my son died in the car wreck, I felt shock, and I also would have to say that because of his lifestyle at the time, I, in some ways, was expecting something like this.
When I heard that Chad had committed suicide, I was really disappointed with God.
When I got word that my grandson died and committed suicide, I felt sad, but I also felt this is a real opportunity to help, because I understand somewhat like a father feels when he loses a child.
I'd like to share right up front that deeply love Dave and Diana Nichols for sharing their story, having the courage to do that. My admiration for them this last week absolutely went through the roof as we got about an hour and 20 minutes of footage. I was mesmerized listening to them just talk and being authentic about some of the pain that they've navigated. You folks have the privilege of being able to worship with them. They happen to come to this service, and I'd love you to do me a favor. Would you just show your appreciation for their courage and sharing their story? As I listen to their story so that you understand kind of the landscape, Dave and Diana have been married actually for right around 8 years, I think is what they share with me, somewhere in that vicinity. Before they got married, Diana watched her father die at age 16. She traveled the road of Alzheimer's with her husband, and then she became a widow at 61. Before they got married, Dave went through the pain that some of you have gone through, are going through, in the pain of divorce. And subsequent to that, got married to a wonderful lady named Patty, and then navigated the loss of his wife as she succumbed to breast cancer and died. Subsequent to them meeting and marrying, it's not like their journey was over. Subsequent to them getting married, Diana received word that her son, you heard his name, Chad, had taken his own life, and she began to navigate that. Subsequent to that, Dave received word that his son was tragically killed in an automobile accident. And then subsequent to that, received word that his grandson had likewise taken his own life. There is a boatload of pain and boatload of suffering. And here's the deal, and Dave and Diana would want me to say this to you. That is their story, and they know you have a story. Your story might be different, but you have a story, and thus the series. We're doing this series making sense of our pain and suffering. Where's God in the middle of it? And here's my hope. I hope you'll come back each of the weeks of this series. Invite somebody you think might need to hear it to come with you. We'll hear a little bit of their story each week. They're not done yet. And I hope you'll do better than that. Maybe you'll get involved in a group if you're not already in a group, and let us help you with that. Our groups are discussing this, how in the world we can make sense out of pain and suffering. At minimum, I would ask you to do this morning as you leave. We, for all of our sermon series, provide little personal journals and devotionals that you can track along with us. So I'd encourage you to go to the Welcome Center, the back table, and grab one of those and kind of journey along in this with us. I shared with you this last week, and I want to go back to kind of make sense of where we're going this week. I've been a pastor for over 20 years, been with people in the snapshot of their life as they've gone through a lot of pain and suffering. And one of the things that I have come to the conclusion of is this, is that pain and suffering, listen real careful, okay? Pain and suffering is neutral. How people navigate it is not. What I mean by that is this. I've watched people go through virtually the same circumstances. Families, for instance, walk through virtually the same circumstances, and I've watched it destroy one family and resurrect another family. I've watched individuals go through virtually the same circumstances, and I've seen some people it ruin their faith, other people it refines their faith. I've watched individuals kind of trek through virtually the same circumstances, and sometimes people come out the other side angry at God, just mad at God. And I've watched other people go through virtually the same circumstances with a deeper appreciation of God, a deeper faith in God. You see, here's what I know. You know this already, that pain and suffering is real, and some of you are going through it right now. Some of you have been through it, but all of us are going to go through it at some point in time, right? And it begs the question, where's God in the middle of that? How do I make sense of that? How do I not only survive it, but how do I somehow get a hold of it in a way that it can have something meaningful to contribute to my life? So last week we just started the conversation, and we started with Jesus. He had a half-brother named James. He wrote a book. And he talked about this a little bit. And we left that conversation saying several things about our pain and suffering. First, we said pain and suffering are just part of life. It's part of the human existence. It's just part of being a person, right? It's something that we're fellow sufferers, all of us. And James taught us this: pain and suffering is inevitable. Can't shortcut it. Can't test out of it. It's inevitable. We will face it. He says, consider joy when you face. It's going to happen. But we went beyond that and said this: it's unpredictable. Pain and suffering is unpredictable. You don't schedule your suffering. You don't plan your problems. You don't plan your pain. It's unpredictable. No day is a good day for a bad day. You don't wake up today and say, today would be a great day for a catastrophe. Nobody does that. But the third thing we said was this, is that it's inevitable, it's unpredictable. We said not all pain and suffering is the same, and that's important. The reason that's important is the very reason we're doing a 5-week series and not a 1-week sermon. Because the reason that not all pain and suffering is the same, and I look out in a crowd this size, and I can tell you we have 31 flavors of pain and suffering, sources and all that kind of stuff. Here's what's important for us to know, because not all pain and suffering is the same. Not one explanation fits every situation. Tracking? I got to be careful that not one explanation fits every situation. There is a variety of sources, a variety of reasons for my pain and suffering. So for the next several weeks, we're going to look under the hood of pain and suffering and kind of identify some of the sources and some of the reasons so that we can better navigate it, so that we can somehow make better sense of it the best we can. Here's what I mean by that. You know this already, but some pain and suffering is a result of sinful choices and decisions. You know that. That sometimes you go through pain and suffering because of sinful decisions. Sometimes the pain and suffering that you face is because of the sinful decisions that you've made, right? And so it brings on hardship and pain and suffering. Can we be honest? Sometimes the pain and suffering that you face, that I face, is the result of sinful decisions other people have made. And you unjustly bear some of the consequences. It changes your life. That's what we're going to talk about next week. I hope you'll come. I hope you'll be a part of it. How in the world do I navigate it when it's my own decisions? How do I navigate it when I'm unjustly part of the crazy, sinful decisions other people have made? Some of you have gone through a kind of pain and suffering that paralyzes you because it's so final. It's the pain of loss, of death. And it can be hard to make sense of that because there is no reverse of that. And so you want to find God in the middle of what seems so final. That's the fourth week. But this morning, I want to talk to you about a pain and suffering that kind of drives you into a land of confusion. I want to talk to you about a pain and suffering where answers are absent, explanations, they're just not around. It's kind of that senseless suffering. It's random acts of pain. It's kind of the inexplicable catastrophes. It's the debilitating diseases, the crippling crisis. You figured out that's the kind of pain that somehow drives us crazy because it's confusing to us. And I want to ask the question, how do I make sense in that, Dan? How do I make sense when answers are not readily accessible? The fact of the matter is that when I look at our culture, we talked about this last week, anthropologists, sociologists all would say this, and I think I agree with them on this, that our Western secular culture is probably the worst and the weakest at handling pain. I think they're right? And the reason for that is we value our freedom and pleasure above anything else. And so the only way for me to look at pain and suffering is it's an interruption. It has no integral part in my life. It's just an interruption. Because what is most valuable is my freedom and my pleasure. I would suggest to you that it's not just Western secular theology that struggles figuring out pain, but I think it's crept into the church. And I think that many people who would call themselves followers of God have no place for pain and suffering in their theology. We've adopted what I would call an American dream theology. Like we have a place for God when things are going great, when there's blessing, right? And He makes my life this and He protects me from this. We have a place for God in the middle of that, but we can't figure out how to fit Him in to a life where things don't make sense and there's hurt and there's pain and there's suffering. I shared this example several months ago. Some of you were here and some of you remember what I'm talking about. When I was a little kid, there was a TV preacher. No names, please, if you remember. But every time he came on, every time, I remember it just like it was yesterday. I remember watching him on the screen. This is what he'd say. He'd look in the screen and he'd point his finger and he'd say, "Something good is about to happen to you today." Yeah, some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've seen it, right? And I remember thinking to myself, man, that sounds cool. You know, I mean, he was charismatic, he was fluent, he was a good communicator, all that kind of stuff. And he'd look and he'd point and man, big smile. And as I grew a little older, I began to think about his comment. I began to think, I wonder how that statement sounded in the ears of the guy who just lost his job that day. I often wondered to myself how that guy's statement with such conviction sounded in the ears of the woman who lost her pregnancy. I often wondered how those words sounded in the ears of families that live in places like Newtown, or families in Flint trying to figure out how to find drinking water, or families who survive earthquakes and floods. I often wondered how that sounded in the ears of a family who buried their son who was tragically killed in an automobile accident by a drunk driver. I wonder how that sounded in the ears of people like Dave and Diana. One of the things I love about the Bible, you ready? Some of you are like, man, I'm brand new to the Bible. I'm so glad you're here. And even if you've never read the Bible, I can tell you something about the Bible. And that's this. The Bible is real. And it does not skirt the raw, gut-wrenching situations that many of us face. I want you to remember this. The Bible never sanitizes suffering. It never makes it smell better, look better. It is real about suffering. It never pretends that pain is not real. The Bible is a real book, and it is about real situations, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story you have opened in your laps. Some of you are familiar with the story open in your laps. Some of you have never heard it, so I need to tell you the story. In Job chapter 1, we meet a guy named, of all things, Job. And it starts out verses 1 through 3, and it tells us about Job, and I'll give you the condensed version. It says this: there was nobody more upright. He was the example of a follower of Christ, worshiper of God. He was the example of somebody who worshiped God, was devout, followed God. Not only that, he was a family man. He had a wife, 10 children. Not only that, he was extremely wealthy. He had a lot of stuff, and he had a lot of people working for him, and he was a man of great respect. There was no one greater. As you read the story, get down to about verse 6, there's something interesting that happens, and that's this. There's a conversation that takes place between Satan and God. It's interesting. Satan presents himself to God. I want to say it that way on purpose. Satan presents himself to God, and here's the first thing that happens in the conversation. God speaks up, and this is what he says. Have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one who follows me more devoutly than Job. Satan says this to God. I see him. But can I tell you something, God? He doesn't really love you. He loves what you give him. He's not really committed to you. He's committed to what you do for him. You think that he's all about you, God. But he's not all about you. He's all about the stuff that he's pretty sure that you have given him in his life. You take away the stuff, he's bolting. God says, very well. The rest of chapter 1, you see Job's life literally falling apart. You can read it. You ought to read it and check me out on this, really. But in a matter of verses, you see one messenger at a time come to Job and say, hey, Job, your livestock gone. Hey, Job, workforce gone. Hey, Job, all of your wealth gone. Hey, Job, your kids were celebrating at the oldest boy's house, and a windstorm came. House collapsed. I don't know how to tell you this, Job, but all your kids are dead. He lost his entire family, all of his wealth, his workforce, his livestock, in a matter of a few verses in your Bible. And this is how he responds in verse 20, chapter 1. At this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head. In that culture, that was like, extreme mourning. He's weeping. He just is turning inside out. Then he fell to the ground in worship, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. This guy's life is totally unraveled. Listen, you ready? Job 2. Satan's not done. Satan presents himself again to God. God says to Satan, have you seen my servant Job? Can we take a little break for a minute? Job has no idea this conversation is going on, but I tend to think that if Job knew the conversation was going on, he might say, hey, God, is there any chance I could fly under the radar for a minute? Is there any chance you could quit pointing me out? Because Satan says this to God. Yeah, I see your servant Job. Sure, he's lost everything, but he's still healthy. He's still got his health. You know something, God? You think he loves you. You think he's committed to you. He's not committed to you. He doesn't love you. What he loves is what you're protecting him from. He's as healthy as a horse. You take that away, he's going to bolt. You're going to find he's just using you, God. God says, very well. And what you find in chapter 2 is literally Job is afflicted with sores from top of his head to the bottom of his feet. In chapter 2, this is what you find. This man, this respected man, this wealthy man is literally sitting in the middle of ashes, scraping his festering wounds with broken pottery. If that's not bad enough, his wife turns on him. Look what she says. His wife says to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Job, curse God and die. It's kind of like, thank you very much, sweetheart, right? He replied, you're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. If you read the story, his wife's over here saying, curse God and die. This is crazy. What are you doing, Job? All of a sudden, Job's got 3 friends. Everybody needs friends when things go bad, right? His 3 friends come and they see that Job, his suffering was incredible. In fact, this is what it says about his friends. They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. They just sat there. Don't forget that. They just sat there. No one said a word to him because they saw, do you see this, how great his suffering was. They came, and Job is just undone. His suffering is incredible. They can see it. Pain has taken its toll on him, and they can see how great his suffering is. 7 days, 7 nights. They sit there in silence, not saying a word, just present with him in his suffering. Then something interesting happens. They begin to talk. And from chapter 3 to chapter 37, you see Job's friends trying to make sense of his suffering. But they weren't like Job's wife. They were trying to make sense of his suffering, and what they were saying to Job was this: you must have done something wrong. God must be angry at you. That's the only way this makes sense, Job. Guys, do you see the picture? Do you see the picture? This guy has lost everything. He's sitting in ashes, scraping his festering wounds. His wife is over here saying, I'm mad at God. There might not even be a God. Curse God. Job's friends are over here saying, God's mad at you. I want you to hear me say something. And if you read the book, Job, with his wife, mad at God, with his friends, pretty sure God's mad at him. Ready? Never in the book of Job does he get an explanation as to why he's suffering so greatly. It's interesting. You see, the reason that's interesting is because some of you know exactly what that's like because you're in the middle of it right now. And the truth is, if you're just being gut level honest, which by the way, if you're new to Grace Church, we tend to find that's the best way to be, gut level honest. You have people in your life that are trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense. You have some people who are saying, well, you're following God all these years, you're trusting, and look what happened to you. It's not worth it. Or maybe you have people in your life saying, you know, I always thought you were a little off center. I think God's mad at you. That stuff that's unraveling in your life, probably something wrong with you. And you're trying to find God in the middle of immense, senseless, inexplicable pain and suffering. How do we make sense of it? I think Job helps us, and I think there's several ways, and I think you should write some of these down. They may help you. Even if they don't make you feel different, I think they'll help you. First is this: I think we can grab from Job's story that making sense of my pain doesn't always make sense. I want you to write it that way, and I want to explain it to you. What I mean is, when we're in pain and suffering, or we know people in pain and suffering, our first default or knee-jerk reaction is to try to find the why, the cause. I think from the story of Job, we can learn something very important as individuals and even as a church and as a community, and that's this. You ready? Pat answers are rarely helpful. Pat answers are rarely helpful. I'm not saying they're never helpful, but they're rarely helpful. And I want to go a step further. Pat answers are rarely helpful, and quite frankly, sometimes they're just downright hurtful. Sometimes they aren't true. Sometimes they're ill-timed. I like what a guy named Francis Anderson says. He says, our pat answers sometimes are thin medicine for a man in such deep suffering. I like that. Sometimes they can feel very shallow in proportion with the depth of how much I'm hurting. Here's what I mean. In our culture, we try to explain pain and suffering. We have pat answers, and we kind of go one of two ways when it comes to our pain, our suffering, the difficulties we face in life. One side of the spectrum is, in our culture, is fatalism. That was Job's wife, right? When we face senseless suffering, see others in these random acts of pain, we are convinced that maybe there's not a God. Or if there is a God, listen, some of you have been here. He's uninvolved. He doesn't really care. He doesn't love you anyways. Or maybe he's just too weak to do anything about it. You read the story of Job, and here's what you walk away with. My pain does not mean that God is uninvolved. It does not mean that he does not care, and it does not mean that he's too weak. We said this last week, that my theology, my view of God, the Bible teaches me about God has to be the lens through which I look at pain and suffering. I can't reverse them. That's what Job's wife was doing. She was putting on the lens of the pain and suffering they were facing and saying, here's what I determined to be true about God. It's easy to do. Our culture would tell us that, well, pain and suffering must be no God. But if there is a God, uninvolved, doesn't care, too weak to do anything. But I think there's a second way that our culture responds to pain and suffering, and I think it even could be more dangerous and pervasive, and that's moralism. That's Job's friends. If you're good, God will make good things happen to you. If you're bad, count on pain and suffering and trial. I love how a guy named Tim Keller puts it. Let me just tell you what he wrote. He said, there's a way of using the Bible, God, and theology that wounds people rather than heals them. It's not the fault of God, the Bible, or theology. It's the fault of miserable comforters who fasten inappropriate fragments of truth, or whose timing is off, or whose attitude is condescending, or whose application is insensitive, or whose true theology is couched in cliches that grate you rather than comfort you. It's interesting, isn't it? The truth is, giving an explanation in the middle of pain and suffering sometimes can be more hurtful than helpful. Some of you know that by experience. What we learn from Job's story is this. My pain doesn't mean God doesn't care. It doesn't mean he's uninvolved. It doesn't mean he's too weak. And it also doesn't mean he's always disappointed. He says, look at Job, man. He's blameless. He's upright. He's like pointing him out as exemplary. God's not pointing him out because he's disappointed, and yet Job is the object of pain and suffering. Some of you need to hear that this morning because you're going through miserable pain and suffering, and somebody has convinced you that it must mean God's mad at you. Somebody's convinced you of that. Doesn't necessarily mean that at all. Job frees us from that. Let me say it this way. Not all pain and suffering is the same. Sometimes you have to, you ready, endure hardship because of sinful decisions you've made. Is this the way it is? Sometimes you're going to have to endure hardship because of sinful decisions other people have made. Come next week. We're going to have a conversation. But sometimes you just endure hardship because you live in a sinful world. You see, I think that's the point here is like when I try to make sense of it, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And Job ends up calling these friends that come after they keep telling him God must be mad at you. In Job 16, look what he says. See if you can relate to this. You guys are miserable comforters. All of you. He says, will your long-winded speeches never end? Have you ever felt that way when you're going through a hard time? It's okay to be real, right? You ever had somebody come to you, you're like just suffering, you're like, don't you got someplace to be? You know, because you're not helping. I mean, Job makes it so real for us that sometimes truth, when it's spoken, you read some of what his friends said, there's some truth in what they said. They're not speaking lies, but if I speak truth and it's not tethered in the character of a God who is gracious and kind, it will be destructive and harmful. They're speaking truth, but it's not tethered in the character of a God who's gracious and kind. Sometimes in the middle of pain and suffering, less words is better. Sometimes in the middle of pain and suffering, less words is better. Bible Band-Aids don't heal. They just cover. I'm not saying the Bible has nothing to say. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if all I do is just slap the same Bible verse over every situation, it may be true, but I may not be able to apply it wisely because I'm not pursuing understanding the situation. Not all suffering is the same. Job's friends were coming and saying, well, you must have done something wrong and this and that and the other thing, and they weren't at all applying wisely truth that wasn't tethered in the character of God. Not only that, you can relate with this. Sometimes it does not help because it's spoken at the wrong time. Timing matters. Anybody shake your head and just say yes like that? Yeah? Timing matters. When you speak, truth matters. A friend of mine who's the pastor at Medina, I like how he says this. He says, the time to tell a woman about the joy of childbirth is not while she's in labor. Can I get an amen on that? That's true, right? The time to talk to her, hey, you know, this is so great. Aren't you glad? The joy of it. It's like, yeah, that's the way to get hurt, right? If you don't believe me, try it. Here's what I want you to write down. Doesn't mean God's disappointed with me, and I want you to write this down and just let it percolate. It's not going to make you feel different. Some pain never gets explained. Some pain never gets explained. Job never gets the full explanation of his pain. And sometimes when there's no explanation, I really want you to lean in on this one. Sometimes when there's no explanation, Saying nothing is better than saying something that's cheesy and superficial. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When my wife and I were in our 20s, we got news that God had given us a gift. There's a little baby on the way. We're so excited, man. Our best friends were expecting like days apart from us. So it's kind of cool. We were celebrating the gift God gave us, and my wife and Vicky is her name. You know, they would talk about pregnancy, go through the pregnancy books together. Just like, woo, this is great. We were just having a blast, looking forward to God bringing our gift into the world. Everything was wonderful. Everything was great. Everything was super. Man, God is so good. God is so good. This is awesome. We're going to be able to celebrate. Our kids are going to grow up together. We're going to love this. Until the morning. Till the morning when it became apparent. I had no idea what was happening. I was young. I had never been through. My wife was miscarrying. I promise you guys, I'll never forget the look in her face. I remember I was taking her to the hospital. I remember I was clueless. I'm like, I don't even know what's happening. I don't even know what's going on. I remember the doctor saying, well, this is miscarriage. You've lost the pregnancy. I remember everything that we were dreaming about, planning about, celebrating, gone over. And I remember a guy coming in and saying this to me. He's saying, Dan, you need to thank God for this. I'm like, really? Why? He said, Dan, this is actually a good thing. God has protected you from a problem this baby probably had. I remember I looked at the guy. It was fresh, guys. It just happened. I remember I looked at the guy and I said, well, thanks for sharing that with me. I said, do me a favor, and don't you ever speak that to my wife. You see, whether or not what he was saying is true or not, I don't know, but I can tell you this. It didn't help me one bit. I can remember when my dad died. I've heard this over and over again at funerals, and I think it's well-meaning people, but this guy came up to me, he was all happy, right? And this is what he says. He says, isn't it awesome? God needed your dad more than you did. I remember I looked at him and I thought inside, I didn't say it out loud. I'm like, that's what we're going to say in the funeral line? Like, yay, God. I remember thinking that, like, really? Like, and what does God need my dad for again? And please don't say that to my mom who's been married to him for over 50 years and she can't figure out how to get through tomorrow. You see, I'm convinced of this, that sometimes silence in the suffering is more powerful than an explanation of the suffering. Sometimes silence in the suffering and suffering with the other is more powerful than trying to explain the suffering to them. I could have used the guy to come in the hospital room and just put his arm around us and say, guys, I'm really sorry. I know that dreams have been dashed. Things that you've been looking forward to are gone. That would have been helpful. If he'd have just sat there and been with us. Sometimes when you try to make sense of the suffering and pain, it doesn't make sense. It's like, what? And even sometimes when people speak truth, and if it's ill-timed, it doesn't help. It's hurtful. But here's what I know. Just because I can't make sense of what's happening to me doesn't mean that I don't feel what's happening in me. Say it again. Just because I can't make sense of what's happening to me doesn't mean that I can't feel what's happening in me. And what I love about Job and what I love about Dave and Diana is they were real about how they feel. Job is in mourning. He's in sackcloth. He's shaved his head, and yet it says he did not sin. It teaches me something in the middle of our pain and suffering, and that's this. Being stoic does not make you spiritual. Being stoic does not make you spiritual. I loved the authenticity of Dave and Diana as they shared their story. I would look at Dave as he was telling his story, recounting his story, and it felt like every time he recounted it, there was another tear that dropped. I loved how real and raw he allowed that to be. Christianity is not stoicism. In fact, I would say this: if you're not real about how you feel, you're probably never going to heal. The Bible is full of people processing their pain. Habakkuk, Elijah, even Jesus, God with flesh on, in the garden, crying out in agony. Psalm 88, a passage that I have read over and over again, I have it underlined in my Bible, says this: darkness is my closest friend. The Bible never sanitizes suffering. It never pretends that pain is not real. Job is grieving. It's real. He's turning inside out. He's broken over what's happened to him. Pain will take a toll on your life. And if I don't come to grips with it, it will eventually come to grips with me. If I bury it, it will eventually grow. If I stuff it, it eventually will explode. If I deny it, I simply am lying about it. Here's what I want you to understand in pain and suffering, and this is important in understanding how you read your Bible. Okay? This is important in a lot of different ways. Satan, you ready, from the very beginning of time, has done his dead level best to drive a wedge between God and man. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. If you read your Bible in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve, right? Satan comes to man, and what does he do? He says, God's not telling you the whole truth. God's not really good. God's not really got your best in mind. You can read it. Check me out on it. Don't take my word for it. He accuses God in front of man. He's like, this is who God is. He really isn't for you. He's holding out on you. There's no reason to believe him, and he hasn't told you the whole truth. In Job chapter 1 and 2, Satan comes to God, and he begins accusing man. He doesn't really love you. He's just using you. You think these people are devoted to you, worshiping you, loving you, serving you? They're not serving you, God. They just like the fact you make their life comfortable. They just like the fact that they got good health. They just like all the stuff you're doing for them. And from the very beginning of time, Satan has tried to drive a wedge, and what he'll use more than anything is pain and suffering. And what he'll say is, in the middle of your pain and suffering, the only way for it to make sense is to drive you away from God, apart from God. And here's what God does in the middle of your pain and suffering. He invites you to be real and raw in his presence in the middle of your pain and suffering. Guys, this is an important point, and some of you need to hear this morning. Job, if you read the book, is crying out. He's complaining, lamenting. He's literally turning himself inside out in the presence of God. There's something important here. I want you to see it. There is a big difference, you ready? There is a big difference between complaining and lamenting to God and complaining and lamenting about God. Job is dead level real in God's presence. He is, In fact, I would say this: sometimes the most profound moments with God are processing your pain with him. I debated whether to share what I'm going to share, but I've shared at the other two services, so I'm going to share it with you as well. About 10 years ago, I walked through some very unjust, miserable times. The details of it are not important for this setting. I was encouraged during that time to not stop talking to God and to begin writing my conversations to God. So I wrote them in this brown book that I keep in my desk drawer. God, I'm stressed out. I'm burnt out. I need you to heal my heart. I am dead inside right now. God, I have no joy. I have no vision. I need you to restore it. I'm tired. I'm hurt, exhausted, anxious about the future. I can't figure out how to find my way back. A few days later, by the way, I was a pastor at this time, in case you were wondering. God, in a few hours, I'm supposed to do the funeral of one of my ball players. I don't think I can do it. I know somehow, in some way, you have recorded my life in a book, so to speak. But God, I think I'm lost in the story. I can't find my way out. few weeks later, God, life seems really hard to navigate right now. It's unjust, it's unfair. You're going to have to help me. I honestly don't feel like anyone cares that I'm dying inside. Where are you? A few weeks later, God, today is the worst day yet. I'm depressed, I'm irritated, I'm agitated. Sometimes I'm not sure it'll ever ease up. Friendship with you, I know, is the goal, but if I'm to be honest, you feel so far away right now. Please help me. No one seems to be reaching out to me. Guys, I can tell you this just personally, and I want to be tender about this. If you had come to me and told me during that time that there would come a day, a decade later, that was a decade ago, there would come a day when I would thank God for walking me through that moment, I wouldn't have believed you then. I just wouldn't have. I wouldn't have felt it. I wouldn't have understood it. But I can stand here in front of you as your pastor, a fellow sufferer, and tell you this, that as a result of processing something that was deep and personal and being real with God in my pain, I was able to understand, experience, and know God in a way that otherwise I wouldn't have. I promise you. Some of you need to hear that this morning because you're in deep pain and you've learned to be stoic in your pain even with God. And so you pray sanitized. Oh God, and la la la, while inside you are coming apart. I want to give you freedom and license this morning. He can handle your pain. And He can handle your realness. And if you're not sure, I'd go read Psalm 88. The Bible is real and raw. And I promise you, if you'll process your pain in front of God and not simply run from God and complain about God, that something happens over time that I believe happened in the life of Job. If you read the book of Job, Job never gets answers to the why of his pain and suffering. Beyond that, God gets angry at the end of the book. Did you know that? He gets angry at his friends because they're giving him all these spiritual platitudes. Once everyone's done talking, in Job 38, verses 1 through 4, God begins his response. The Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, and he said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I'll question you, and you'll answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand." For the next several chapters, God speaks of his creation. He asks Job, can you even comprehend creation? Where were you when I made everything that is? Can you care for my creation? Job, do you have the ability to control my creation? And you read that and you're like, that seems like a weird response. It's interesting, when God gets the platform, he doesn't answer Job's question of why. He only answers the who. He doesn't go to the cause. He goes to the creator. And when you get to Job 42, here's the response. Verse 1. Job replied to the Lord, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I'll speak. I'll question you and you'll answer me." Verse 5. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." What's the point? I want you to write this down and then I'll flesh it out. When answers are absent, that's when I need to run into a God who's present. When answers are absent, I think that's what's happening into Job. Job never gets the answers. He never gets the full explanation of why he's going through this. But when answers are absent, that's when I need to run into a God who's present. And here's a key. I hope you won't forget this. If I will run into God, some of you, I want to be tender about this. If I'll run into God when there are no answers in the depths of my pain, that's when I begin to experience my theology. Do you see what Job says, verse 5, chapter 42? He says, "I heard of you, but now I see you. You see, I would put it this way. Many of us have an audio view of God. If I said to you, hey, let's experience the baseball game together. There's two ways we can experience it. We can listen to it on my transistor radio, or we can go to the stadium and watch it play out. I don't know about you, but I want to see the thing play out, right? Many of us have an experience with God that's on audio, and it's only when I walk with him into the depths of my pain and suffering that what was audio, I only have heard of you, becomes video. I begin to experience God in a way unlike I've ever experienced him. Here's the deal, guys. When you run into a God who's present, you're going to find two things. You need to know this. It'll help make sense of your pain and suffering. First, you're going to find a God who's sovereign. That's the book of Job. He's powerful. There's nothing that escapes his notice. He's a God who is a sovereign God, all-powerful, all-knowing. You read the story of Job, and here's what you find out. He's in control, even when I've lost control. God never loses control of the situation. He is never out of control of the situation. Some of you need to hear that because your life feels out of control. And when you run into the presence of God, you realize there's a God, even if it doesn't feel that way, he is in control right now. Nothing surprises God. Nothing is beyond God. Beyond that, he's a God who sees what I don't see, and he knows what I don't know. That's key. He sees what I can't get my hands on, and he knows what I don't understand. He has a perspective that's much bigger than mine. Guys, you know this if you've been in pain. Pain will diminish your perspective. When you're in pain, your perspective is right here. And that's Job. He's sitting there and he's in the ashes and he's struggling. And what God does in chapters 38 through 42 is he says, Job, I want you to know something. I want you to run into me, trust me, and I see what you don't see. I love that. I shared this example a few months ago. Some of you remember it. But as a little kid, and I'd be walking in a crowded place and I'd be exhausted and tired, and when are we going to get there, Dad, and this, that, and the other thing. It's like, I can't believe it, I'm frustrated, and I just want to sit down. And my dad, in order to help me sometimes, you know what he'd do? He'd yank me and he'd pull me and put me up on his shoulders. And I'd be like, oh, wow. So this is what you've been telling me's coming. Oh, wow. You really do know where you're going. Oh, wow. We're going to get there. I think what God does with Job, he says, wait, Job, put you on my shoulders for a minute. I know it. This is awful. Let's not pretend it's not awful. You can be real about how you feel and still be robust in your faith. You can be real about how you feel and still be robust in your faith. And he says, I'm a God who sees what you don't see. I'm bigger than you thought I was. In your pain and suffering, don't allow that to diminish your view of God. Don't box God in. Evelyn Underhill says it, I love how she says it. She said, a God small enough to fully understand is not big enough to be worshipped. I like that. But not only that, I think that God being sovereign means he is involved when I cannot tell what he's doing. Like he's doing something. That's interesting to me. I'm sure from Job's perspective, it's like God's gone missing in action. Where's God? And yet, when we get to read the story, we actually have a benefit. We read the story. Do you see what God's doing? Satan is coming and he's accusing Job of not really loving and being committed to God. And what does God do? He turns Satan's tactics on himself. Because you get to the end of it and you find a man who's lost everything. But I'm going to tell you this. He understands God in a multidimensional way. You see, for some of you this morning, maybe you have a black and white faith and God wants to take you into the world of color. And I don't have explanations, pat answers, and I'm not saying you ought to put a cheesy smile on your face. I'm just saying that he's sovereign. He is still there in control, knows what you don't know, sees what you don't see, and he's doing something. I can trust that. But I can't just stop there. When I run into God in the middle of my pain and suffering, I don't just see a God who's sovereign. I got to press even deeper. And you know what I find? I find a God who's suffering. You see, when Jesus came, that's God with skin on, and I see a God who's suffering for me, and that tells me something. When I can't explain my pain, it at least tells me what it's not. And my pain and suffering is not because God doesn't care about me nor love me. You know how I know that? Because I can look at a cross and see that that is God not just suffering with me, but he's suffering for me. He's suffering for me. And see, I might not have all the explanations. And Christianity doesn't offer all the explanations for your pain and suffering, but listen, but it does offer the final answer. And the final answer is found in Jesus. You see, in the middle of your pain and suffering might be your most profound moments with a God who's sovereign and a God who suffers with and for you this morning. I'm going to ask if you'd do me a favor and pray with me this morning. I'd like you to just bow your heads. I'm going to ask the worship team to come out. We're going to close. Guys, I know probably not a ton of what I said this morning is going to take away some of y'all's pain and suffering. I get that. You're going to feel certain ways. I get that. I didn't expect it to. The truth is, you might be sitting here this morning and you've never said yes to Jesus. You've never said yes to the God who suffered for you. He took your place. Some of you grew up religious. You've been religious. You've been in church from knee-high to a grasshopper on. And you're working to make sure God's pleased with you. And you've embraced a moralistic theology. If I'm good, good things happen. If I'm bad, bad things will happen. But you've never said yes to the God who suffered in your place, to Jesus paying the price. And this morning, you can do that right there in your seat. Say, yes, Jesus, I know that I'm a sinner. And I believe that Jesus died in my place for my sin. This morning, I want to say yes to him as my Savior. Yes to him is the only way for me to be forgiven of my sin. Yes to him is the only way for me to have a relationship with God. But I believe he was buried and rose again. So I want to say yes to him as the leader and Lord and coach and director of my life for the rest of my life. Truth is, if you prayed or had that conversation with God in your seat, I desperately desire that you will let me know that. Some of you, a lot of you have said yes to Jesus, and you know this, that simply saying yes to Jesus doesn't mean that everything's easy and a piece of cake from here on out. And some of you are in the middle of deep, deep suffering, and I just want to say a few words to you. Be careful not to too quickly, too flippantly try to make sense out of what might not make sense. Be careful of flippant answers that might do more harm than good. But I would encourage you this way. Press into God. In the middle of your agony, in the middle of your questions, in the middle of your confusion, as Diana said, in the middle of being disappointed with God. Be real with God in your pain and allow him to take your real feelings and take you somewhere robust in your faith. Something that's hard to get your head around, something that's even hard to explain, something that goes from audio to video. And if you'll press into God, I promise you that somewhere in the journey, you begin to appreciate and understand that God is bigger than you thought. He's sovereign. He's in control when you have lost all control. That he sees what you don't see, and he says, trust me, I know this is hard. I know there's no answer for it. It's inescapable, but trust me. I'm doing something. You just trust me. And you can trust me because I'm not only the God that's sovereign, I'm the God who suffered for you. You can trust me because you know at least that it's not because I don't care about you. I love you more than you dreamed. Some of you right there in your seat need to say, God, I this morning just need to be real about how I feel. And I want to lament and agonize and cry and weep and process with you in your presence. I'm done running away from you, trying to make sense of my life, trying to find answers that escape me. God, at the end of the day, this song we end with is the prayer that I pray will be the one that resonates in our heart. Lord, we need you this morning and you alone.